Inclusive Lafayette is a grassroots organization dedicated to making Lafayette accessible to everyone, regardless of race and class. Inclusive Lafayette members work to research, educate the community, and advocate for inclusive policies. At our last meeting, we discussed our perceptions of Lafayette and explored changes we'd like to see. Today, we'll be diving into the side of Lafayette's history that you did not learn about in elementary school, and we will learn about the impacts of racist housing policies on our town and explores ways to advocate for inclusive housing. Our conversation will be led by Acalanes environmental science teacher and former Lafayette resident, James Poling. James Poling, nice to see you again.
Good to see you too, Benji, and everybody on the top row here for me. And good to see so many new faces at this meeting. We've got a real kind of changing of the guard for this meeting in particular. Last time we were almost entirely students, handful of adults. Now I'm really excited to see kind of a shift. We've got a lot more adults involved in the conversation, and that's important. We need everybody. So like Benji said, we are going to be talking today a little bit about sort of the history of housing in the Lamorinda area and really suburbs in general. I'm going to try to keep the history lesson pretty brief, since I'm sure a lot of the people in this call already know a lot of that history. And we're also going to be talking about, given the context of the history of housing in Lafayette, how do we talk to people in our community about changing that housing situation? How do we do that diplomatically and carefully, but still effectively? So let's dive in. Before I start doing all the talking for like 30 minutes straight, I want to give you guys a chance to get to know each other. Like I said, everybody on this call obviously cares about making Lafayette more inclusive, but we probably have a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different reasons for being here in the first place. So in just a second, Wei-Tai is going to open up some breakout rooms of 4 or 5 people at a time, or per group. We're going to ask you to jump into that breakout room, just introduce yourself to the other people there, tell them who you are, how old you are, how long you've lived in Lafayette, and what was your interest in coming to this meeting? What drew you here? Why are you here today? So what we're going to do next is kind of dive into a very brief history lesson about sort of the history of suburbanization and how suburbs like Lamorinda got to where they are. So I didn't want to do a whole big lecture about this, so I did what all good teachers did in distance learning, and I went and found a YouTube video for it. So let's go to that. I've got screen share. There we go. The history being covered there hopefully was not super new to anybody, but maybe it was. So I'll go back through and do a very quick review of what they talked about and sort of the racist policies that created our suburbs. Susan, do you have a question? Susan, you're still muted. So I'm gonna dive into
I thought we were talking about Lafayette.
We are going to be talking about Lafayette, yes. Yeah, so we're talking about some of the general historical trends that got Lafayette to where it is. Let's dive into it. Oh, come on, there we go. Oh, no. Zoom and YouTube don't like each other. There we go, okay. The video does a pretty solid job of diving into the policies of redlining and other explicitly racist housing policies. And those policies have been abolished, but that abolishing didn't magically make suburbs become racially integrated. Banks and other financial institutions have continued to discriminate against people of color and make it harder for them to find housing in these suburbs. But what we're going to talk about today is not the original explicitly racist policy like redlining, but what we're going to talk about is sort of the culture that came out of those suburbs that had been segregated for so long. So when redlining and policies like it were abolished, the fight to keep suburbs white and to keep them segregated and to keep them preserved kind of became a cultural fight instead of a legal one. So suburbanites started to organize around resistance to people moving into their communities from the outside. They took on fundraising tasks. They started to organize around activism and political agitation to resist building affordable housing or any other projects in their communities that might bring people of color or people without economic advantages into those communities. And altogether, this general trend of avoiding integration became known by the moniker of NIMBY, or not in my backyard, referring to just generally the refusal to let outsiders or people not of your community move into your community because of some perceived fear or concern about how it will hurt that community. So it's really important for us to keep this in context, that the NIMBY culture and the NIMBY attitude really does come from more explicitly racist history. And there's a pretty clear line to be drawn there. But I don't want to just focus on the history. I want to focus on what NIMBYs are today in our community, because this process of suburbanization, white flight, and redlining, and then the NIMBY movement happened all over the country. But it happened quite uniquely in the San Francisco Bay Area. So those openly racist policies that created suburbs like the Lamorinda suburbs ended about 50 years ago, which means that many of Lafayette and Lamorinda's current residents maybe don't know about those racist policies that created our communities. Combine that with the proximity of Lamorinda to places like San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley, which have really been centers of like left-leaning, liberal-leaning progressivism. And Lamorinda, by its proximity, followed in the same kind of footsteps. So with these two kind of conflicting ideals, the modern East Bay NIMBY kind of has to deal with some cognitive dissonance, or the need to hold two different contradictory ideas in their head at the same time. From the Lamorinda NIMBY perspective, racism ended in the Bay Area a long time ago. And now Lamorinda and other suburbs like it are. What's up? Oh, I thought somebody interrupted with a question. Sorry, I just must have heard something. So from this NIMBY perspective, Lafayette, Moraga, Orinda, Danville, Pleasanton, other similar suburbs are full of tolerant, anti-racist, progressive people. And these places just happen to be some of the most racially segregated places in California, maybe by coincidence. And that's what I mean by there's this kind of cognitive dissonance for the modern Bay Area NIMBY, who is probably a fairly left-leaning, fairly progressive, socially minded person who wouldn't call their community racist, but they can't explain why their community is so gosh darn white. So as we talk about how to engage with NIMBYs and how to talk to them and how to engage with them politely and respectfully, keep in mind that this is a recognition that they might not have made yet. They might not have connected these dots. They might not have had the same kind of education. Like Benji said in the introduction, this is a history that we don't get taught. I had to go out and find this for myself. Nobody taught me that Lamorinda, Lafayette, the town that I grew up in, was structurally racist at its core. I kind of had to piece that together. So we need to be understanding that the NIMBYs that we talk to and the NIMBYs we hear from might not have made this connection yet. And that's not their fault, but we need to move forward in a way that respects where they're at. So the goal of this meeting was not just to provide a history about NIMBYs and like explain where they came from. It's not an origin story for NIMBYs. What we really want to talk about is how to engage with NIMBYs in an effective way.
James, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Sorry, this is
sure, Meredith.
With me.
Yeah.
So I know explicitly, like on when I bought my home, it explicitly says on the title that it cannot be sold to a person of color, and the only way that that is not enforced anymore is there's a stamp on it saying anything racist in the title is no longer enforceable. So I have specific knowledge of that one thing that is clearly a way that was keeping people of color out of my neighborhood in particular. And my neighborhood was built in the 50s. So, you know, anyway, but I am challenged. And so I just, before we even engage with NIMBYs, I actually am a little challenged because I'm not sure. Oh, okay, I see Jeremy. So could you just explain a little bit, like if there were, so that was a housing covenant, right? Like, but what else especially affected Lafayette? Do you know what?
With regards to specific policies, like redlining that would have been targeting Lafayette or like Lamorinda suburbs, I don't know of any specific policies, but I do know that some of the most egregious examples of redlining did happen in San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley, and that kind of forced, in a lot of ways, a white flight out to the suburbs. So that's where many of the original residents of Lafayette, not the original residents, but a lot of the longtime residents of Lafayette who have been here for multiple generations, that's where they came from. So I don't think I have any specific policies I can point to, but generally speaking, this trend of suburbanization and redlining did spiral into what we know as NIMBYs nowadays.
Okay, thanks.
I think Susan Callister has her hand raised. Susan, is
Yes,
okay.
Further to what Jeremy said, we didn't exactly have white flight here. My parents were involved after World War II, came out here. People were coming from Berkeley and Oakland and San Francisco through the tunnel because the homes were cheaper.
Yeah.
And that's why they were coming. It didn't have anything to do with color. And my parents came through the tunnel and they bought my uncle's house on Bickerstaff for $12,000 because my uncle worked for Westinghouse and it moved down to Sunnyvale. So a lot of the homes that people moved to out here, the older homes, like on Bickerstaff, Moraga Boulevard were homes that people came to during the summer. So it wasn't exactly a white flight that people couldn't afford because of their color. They were leaving because people of other colors were living there. People of all colors came. It just so happened, majority that we had out here for the time being were white people, unfortunately. But it wasn't a racial thing. It was more of a, what kind of a job do you have and how much money are you gonna make?
Yeah, I think the incentives for people coming out to this part of the Bay Area were absolutely economic. And I can't point to historic evidence of Lafayette specifically to say that they did or did not have race covenants. It sounds like Meredith had some experience with that with her home deed. But I think—
Jeremy, you know the race covenants came from the banks and came from the government, didn't come from the people.
I think nobody's trying to say that the people in this area are active in or complicit in this racism. I think the video actually does a really good job of saying that we don't have to call ourselves racist or say that the white people living here are racist, but it is important to recognize that there were racist policies that influenced the way this place, Lafayette or Lamorinda, developed. So
I've got one more thing and then I'll shut up.
Okay.
In the olden days, in the 50s, the mothers would drive their kids to school and drop their husbands off at the Greyhound bus station down there on the corner of next to where Campana, across the place that's for rent right now. And then they would pick up their cleaning women, mainly Black from Oakland, that would come out and work. They would come in on the buses. The men would, there was no BART then, the men would take the bus to San Francisco and Oakland to work. Now, I thought that was racist, and I was in 7th grade, and I let my parents know that. I won't tell you what happened thereafter, but we did talk about it.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, your experience seeing different kind of different relationships between races through Lafayette's history is really valuable. And I'm hoping that this meeting maybe helps you sort of contextualize your experiences with other people's experiences in Lafayette. So I wanted to dive into how we can communicate with NIMBYs and how we can maybe convince them to our way of thinking. So currently, NIMBYs and NIMBY voices really dominate the conversation about affordable housing in our area. And if we are to change that, if we are to combat that, we need to learn how to effectively and politely use our voices to do so. So my first tip for engaging with NIMBYs effectively is acknowledging their valid concerns. The average NIMBY probably has a lot of concerns, some of them valid, some of them maybe not so valid, about adding affordable or high density housing to their community. Concerns like construction noise, environmental impact affecting property tax values, and increased traffic, those are all totally valid concerns. And regardless of how important you think those things are, you do, whenever you're talking with a NIMBY, you need to acknowledge that their concerns are valid before you move anywhere else. Because if you dismiss those concerns, you don't make them feel like they have any chance of really having a dialogue. You make it more of a lecture. So it's also important to know that there are invalid concerns. Some of these can be dog whistles or surrogate issues for other expressions of racism. So one example of that would be if someone is really concerned that bringing people from lower socioeconomic brackets, lower incomes into Lamorinda, maybe those people are, they're from low income areas and they may be more dangerous, or they may have criminal history. That's kind of a dog whistle that, the NIMBY is not trying to say anything racist or not trying to sound racist, but they are trying to convey what is at its core a kind of racially motivated fear. So when you hear concerns like that maybe are like rooted in a more systemic racism, it's important to understand where those are coming from. I don't really have a good way to tackle those issues. It's probably not a great idea to just call someone out openly as a racist, but you should at least be able to separate out what are their valid concerns and what are their not so valid concerns. And the valid ones you should acknowledge. The second tip I have is to not get lost in the weeds. So oftentimes NIMBYs have a lot of very kind of nitpicky details about why they oppose a project, or, oh, you can't put that that complex there without 3 additional parking spots, because if you don't have those 3 additional parking spots, it's going to create a traffic jam every morning. Don't engage with those like finer quantitative details, those really kind of minor nitpicky details. When you do that, you lend credence to what the NIMBY person is saying, and you kind of buy into their narrative. And then you're engaging with them on their terms rather than on your terms. So don't get lost in the weeds of the very specific issues that they have. You can acknowledge them, but don't try to argue about them. That's a losing battle, and it's just going to wear you out, and you're going to lose breath, and you're not going to make any headway. The biggest one that I really want to focus on is appealing to shared values, because I think a lot of the people in our community in Lamorinda are already NIMBYs, but it's because they're NIMBYs by default, because NIMBY talking points have really dominated the dialogue around housing. The only thing that people have heard about high density housing or affordable housing is all of the bad stuff it's going to do. If I think about the Lafayette Terraces project, the only stuff that I've heard represented in the media are all of the things I should be worried about with that project. But we can just as easily change that narrative. And instead of talking about the things that we should worry about with any upcoming project, we can add in the things that we should be excited about. So for example, one of the most common NIMBY talking points is about, or against affordable housing developments, is how it will lower property tax values and how that's a problem for school funding. This is going to be a huge concern for most Lamorinda parents. Lamorinda parents, by and large, really care about the schools, as they should. But that means that any threat to school funding automatically makes this person a NIMBY. They go on the defensive and they say, I don't want my schools hurt, impacted by this. I'm immediately against this high density housing. But instead of that, what if we took the high density housing and showed them the positives that that would provide for our school? You know, if you bring in high density housing near a school, you're going to get a greater diversity of students attending that school. And for a school like Acalanes or Miramonte or anything in Lamorinda, any school in Lamorinda, those schools could really benefit from having a greater diversity of voices. And that's something that most Lamorinda parents could probably also get behind. They just haven't heard it pitched that way. So a big part of what we're going to try to do today in our discussions is find ways to flip the narrative or to shift the focus of a discussion to make it appeal more to the values that you and the NIMBY person might share rather than all of the concerns that the NIMBY person has themselves. Kind of building off of that, my fourth tip is to find hidden supporters. And by hidden supporters, I mean, there are people that obviously benefit from high density housing or affordable housing being built. Construction companies benefit from it. Local business owners benefit from it because they get new customers. But there are a lot of hidden supporters who might not realize that they'll benefit from this high density housing. So that can be people in like equity advocacy groups, environmental groups, talking to the local chamber of commerce and other local business owners can really help reveal some hidden supporters that you can find. So the person you're talking to, the NIMBY that you're talking to, might not realize that they could personally benefit from this project. And just by talking with them, just by having a conversation with them, you might be able to pull that out of them and realize, oh, there is something in this project for me. I don't just have to be afraid of what it's going to do. I might actually get something out of this. And if you can give somebody a personal stake in a project like that, they are going to change their minds very quickly. I think here, wow, there's a really great discussion going on in the chat. Up this last tip, and then we can go into some of those questions. The last tip that I wanted to give was assuming best intentions. Even if, I mean, just from that video and from our conversation today, we know that the NIMBY attitude has some roots in structural racism, systemic racism. And when you're engaging with a NIMBY, whether or not they realize that their talking points are rooted in some systemic racism, it can get kind of frustrating trying to engage with that person if they don't realize the structures behind their opinions and behind their beliefs. But it's really important to always assume that the person you're talking to has these beliefs and they're held genuinely and they're held sincerely and they hold them for a good reason. Assume that they are trying to do the best thing for Lafayette, just like you are. They might just not have the same information or the same background that you do. That doesn't mean they're doing a bad thing. It just means they're either not as informed as you are. So assume that they are doing their best and trying their best. If you want to read two articles that were really enlightening for me, I will link these both in the chat in just a little bit. Actually, maybe, Wei Tai, I think you have access to this presentation. If you want to link these articles in the chat, that would be great. These are great. I just kind of drew my 5 tips from these 2 articles and consolidated them.
Okay, I'll put them in the chat when we get back from the breakouts.
Yes, yeah, let's dive into those breakout rooms. Oh, wait. Yeah, were there any questions in the chat? Okay, I see a question from Eric Law. How do we deal with the media that focuses on NIMBY concerns and not the benefits? So the media that you choose to subscribe to and you choose to get involved with, and consume obviously has a huge impact on how you view these issues. I can only suggest for you that you don't consume that type of media, but if you're trying to get other people to change the media they consume and maybe change the opinions that they've heard of, nothing's better than just starting a conversation with that person. And
the challenge is, James, the NIMBYs get so much more airtime than the inclusive folks, right? I mean, there's nothing like scaring the sheeples, right? The media loves that, right? When you come out with fire danger, or you come out with any other NIMBY line, greedy developers is the favorite one I hear all the time. The media jumps on it, right? The mainstream media, our local media, they all jump on it, they all cover it. And so you get this airtime. And so how do we counteract that, right? I can't tell people, hey, go stop following XYZ media channel. Because unfortunately, some people take it as gospel, right?
Yeah, and I think you can, unfortunately, the only way to combat that might be on a more personal level. You can't control what type of media someone else consumes or where they get their information, but you can like have your own responses kind of locked and ready to go. Like that video that I started this lesson, or this, oh God, I'm not a teacher for you guys, at least. This is more of a discussion, not a lesson. I had that video locked and loaded because it's quick, it's short, and it presents a perspective that other people may not have heard. So that's what I would do, is just kind of always keep something locked and loaded that might surprise someone or shock someone or kind of push them out of their comfort zone with new information. That's the best I think I can recommend. And just have conversations with these people, being willing to talk to them, meet them where they're at, acknowledge their concerns, but then try to open them up to new information.
James,
Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
Next door is how I found you, because I was reading some really anti-housing stuff. I think that may be a place that we should be following, because we can write responses to some of these people who are fearful and making everybody else fearful about any kind of project. That's number one. The other is Lamorinda Press, the letters to the editor of Lamorinda, the free weekly that gets thrown around. So I think, you know, as much as we want to do one-on-one, I think we need to follow the other side and try to respond, like you say, with sensitivity. Yeah, anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I think these conversations could happen in person, but they can absolutely happen over social media, like Nextdoor, Facebook, whatever you're on. Wherever you see NIMBY perspectives or NIMBY talking points being used, feel free to jump into that discussion. Again, engage with it in a friendly way, in a polite way, but yeah, dive into the conversation wherever it's happening. That's really how we change this, is like, we don't let those attitudes of fear be the only voice. If that's why they're so predominant, is because they have been the only voice in these conversations for a good time. Okay, so people are in a talking mood, and I want to capitalize on that, just like I do with my students. So let's get through this. I want us to jump into breakout rooms for about 5 minutes to start. And in these breakout rooms, I want you to talk with the other adults in the room, or young folks, since we got a few of you, about the kinds of NIMBY-like concerns that you hear from people in your community. This could be your neighbor down the street. This could be your closest friend that's lived here just as long as you have. These could be your peers at work in this area. How do these people feel about the way their community's changing? What kind of changes are they worried or concerned about? And just kind of what do you hear about NIMBY attitudes, whether it's about like a specific project like the Lafayette Terraces, or just generally about the way that our communities are changing? What have you heard? We're only